My name is Harper, I'm 28 years old, and the morning I discovered my Subaru Outback missing from my apartment parking lot, I thought someone had stolen it. I stood there in the early dawn light, coffee mug trembling in my hand, staring at the empty space where my pride and joy should have been. I had a crucial job interview in exactly 2 hours, a marketing position that could finally pull me out of retail management hell, and my car had vanished. Panic clawed at my throat as I fumbled for my phone and called my parents, because surely they'd help me figure this out. Surely they'd comfort me in this crisis. My mother, Patricia, answered on the third ring, her voice casual and light, almost cheerful when she said the words that would change everything. "Oh, we gave it to your brother Blake. He needed it more than you do, sweetheart. You understand, don't you? You're so capable, you'll figure something out." The phone nearly slipped from my fingers as her words registered, as the betrayal crashed over me like ice water, as I realized my own family had stolen from me without asking, without permission, without even the basic respect of a conversation. Before I take you through what happened next, I need to know where all of you are watching from today. Are you dealing with family drama too? Have your parents ever crossed a boundary that left you speechless? Drop your location in the comments, and smash that like button if you've ever felt taken for granted by the people who should protect you. Hit subscribe because this story gets so much worse before it gets better, and you're going to want to see how I fought back against a family that thought it'd just roll over and accept their betrayal. Trust me, what happened with that car was just the beginning of a war I never wanted but absolutely had to win. Growing up in my family meant understanding your role and never questioning it, meant accepting that some people mattered more than others, meant swallowing your hurt and calling it love. My father Gerald worked as an accountant, the kind of man who balanced numbers with precision but somehow never noticed how unbalanced his treatment of his children had become. My mother Patricia stayed home, dedicating herself to managing the household and especially to managing the emotional temperature around my younger brother Blake, who at 25 still lived in their basement and hadn't held a job for longer than 4 months in his entire adult life. But Blake wasn't the problem. Not really. He was just the symptom of parents who had decided before I could even speak that I would be the strong one, the capable one, the one who didn't need help or comfort, or basic fairness. The pattern started when I was maybe 7 years old, and Blake was 4, when he threw a tantrum in a grocery store because he wanted a toy car, and my mother bought it for him immediately while I stood there clutching a book I'd been saving my allowance for, watching my mother coo over Blake's tears, and completely ignore my quiet disappointment. That became the template for everything that followed. That moment when I learned that squeaky wheels get grease and silent suffering gets nothing but more expectations. Blake got a PlayStation for his 10th birthday while I was told that video games would rot my brain, even though I'd done all my chores and earned straight grades for months hoping for the same gift. Blake got new school clothes every fall, while I wore hand-me-downs from cousins and neighbors. And when I asked why, my mother said I was so good at making things work, so creative with mixing and matching, so much more mature than Blake who needed new things to feel confident. By the time I was 15, I had 3 part-time jobs because I wanted a phone, and my parents said they couldn't afford one for me, even though Blake had gotten one at age 12 without asking. I worked at a local diner on weekends, babysat the neighbors' kids 2 evenings a week, and did yard work for elderly Mrs. Chen down the street, saving every dollar in a shoebox under my bed because I didn't trust that money in a bank account my parents could access. I bought my own school supplies, my own prom dress, my own class ring, and every single purchase felt like proof that I was doing life wrong, that I should have been born needier, weaker, more demanding like Blake, who got everything handed to him while barely managing to graduate high school with a 2.1 grade point average. College was where the real divide became undeniable, where I couldn't pretend anymore that my parents loved us equally but just showed it differently. Blake got a full ride from my parents for his apartment near campus, a 2-bedroom place with updated appliances and furniture they bought from a local store, spending probably $6,000 setting him up like a king, while he majored in something vague called general studies, and spent most of his time partying. Meanwhile, I worked 3 jobs throughout college, lived in a converted storage room I shared with 2 other girls in a house near campus, survived on ramen, and whatever food I could snag from my restaurant job, and still managed to graduate with a business degree and only $18,000 in student loans. My parents came to Blake's high school graduation and threw him a party with probably 80 guests. But when I graduated college with honors, my mother said they couldn't make it, because Blake had a cold and needed her home to make him soup. That became my role, the capable daughter who didn't need celebration or acknowledgement, or basic parental pride, the daughter who existed to make everyone else's life easier, while her own struggles were invisible. When Blake wrecked his first car at 19 because he was texting and driving, my parents bought him another one within a month and never mentioned the accident again. When I asked if they could co-sign a small loan, so I could buy a used vehicle for my 45-minute commute to my first real job, my father said he didn't believe in enabling dependence, and I needed to learn financial responsibility. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it, but I swallowed it down like I swallowed everything else. Turned around and saved every penny from my assistant manager position at the grocery store, where I'd been working since college ended, and real life began. It took me 3 years of living in a tiny studio apartment with a broken heater. 3 years of skipping meals and wearing the same 4 outfits to work. 3 years of saying no to every social invitation, because I couldn't afford the gas money to drive anywhere. But I finally saved enough to buy my Subaru Outback. It was a 2017 model, used but well-maintained, forest green with cloth seats and a sunroof that actually worked. And the day I drove it off the lot with my own money, my own insurance, my own registration, in my own name, I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes because it was mine, not a gift with strings attached, not something I owed anyone for, not a favor I'd have to repay with gratitude and submission, but truly and completely mine, the first major thing I'd ever owned that nobody could take away or hold over my head. I took care of that car like it was made of glass, changing the oil every 3,000 miles, keeping the interior spotless, parking far away from other vehicles to avoid door dings, and every time I slid behind the wheel I felt capable in a way my parents had never meant when they used that word. To them, capable meant convenient, meant I wouldn't complain or ask for help, meant I'd solve my own problems so they wouldn't have to think about me. But in that car, capable meant powerful, meant independent, meant free from a family system that had used me as an emotional support animal for my brother's fragile ego, since before I understood what was happening. That Subaru represented my escape, my future, my proof that I could build a life that didn't revolve around making myself smaller so Blake could feel bigger. 2 weeks before the morning it disappeared, Blake had crashed his Toyota Camry into a median barrier while driving drunk after a party, totaling the vehicle, and somehow escaping with only minor bruises, because the universe protects fools and golden children. My parents didn't report it to insurance because Blake already had 2 accidents on his record, and they couldn't afford the rate increase, didn't press charges or demand he get help for his drinking, didn't even make him pay the towing fee. Instead, they called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, and my mother's voice had that particular wheedling tone she used when she wanted something she knew I wouldn't want to give. She asked if Blake could borrow my car temporarily, just until they figured out his transportation situation, just for a few weeks, and I could maybe take the bus to work or carpool with someone. I said no so firmly and clearly that even I was surprised by my own backbone, explained that I needed my car for my 45-minute commute each way, that I'd worked too hard for it to risk someone else damaging it, that Blake's transportation wasn't my responsibility. My mother shifted tactics immediately, her voice turning hurt and small, saying she understood I had to look out for myself, but couldn't I see that Blake was really struggling right now, that he was depressed and needed support? That family was supposed to help family in times of crisis. My father got on the line and said I was being selfish, that I'd always had this streak of selfishness that disappointed them, that the capable daughter they'd raised wouldn't hesitate to help her brother in need. I held firm despite the familiar guilt clawing at my insides, despite the old programming screaming that I was bad and wrong for having boundaries, despite the voice in my head that sounded like my mother saying I was cruel and ungrateful. I told them Blake could take the bus like I'd done for years before I could afford a car, that he could ask his many friends for rides, that he could even get a bike or use rideshare apps, but my Subaru was not available. My father hung up on me, and my mother called back an hour later to say she understood, that she respected my decision, that they'd find another solution, and I shouldn't worry about it anymore. I actually believed her, believed that for once they'd accepted a boundary I'd set, believed we'd turned some corner in our dysfunctional dynamic. Looking back now, I can see how naive that was, how I'd mistaken their strategic retreat for actual respect, how they were already planning to take what I wouldn't freely give. But in that moment, standing in my little kitchen stirring pasta, and feeling proud of myself for saying no, I thought maybe things could change. Maybe I could train them to treat me better. Maybe being capable could finally mean something other than being exploited. The morning my car disappeared, I stood in that empty parking space for probably 5 full minutes after my mother's casual confession, my brain struggling to process what she'd actually said, struggling to reconcile the mother, Hode promised to respect my boundaries, with the mother Hode just admitted to stealing my vehicle. When the reality finally penetrated, when I understood that they'd actually taken my car in the middle of the night like thieves, that they'd given it to Blake without permission or even warning, the rage that flooded through me was so intense I thought I might pass out. But I didn't have time for rage, didn't have time for the breakdown I could feel building behind my eyes. Because I had exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes to get to an interview that could change my entire life, and I was standing in a parking lot with no transportation, and parents who clearly gave zero concern for how their actions affected me. I called a rideshare app with shaking fingers, watched the price estimate climb to $38 for a one-way trip, nearly double the usual rate because of morning surge pricing, and felt my checking account weep as I confirmed the ride. The driver arrived 12 minutes later, a nice woman named Sonia, who tried to make small talk while I sat in the back seat fighting tears. My carefully planned interview outfit feeling like a costume, my prepared answers evaporating from my mind as I replayed my mother's words over and over. "You're so capable, you'll figure something out," as if capability was a personality trait that made theft acceptable, as if my competence gave them permission to take advantage, as if I should be grateful they believed in my ability to handle their betrayal. I arrived at the marketing firm's office building 15 minutes late despite leaving my apartment with what should have been plenty of time. My professional composure shattered before I even walked through the glass doors. The receptionist's sympathetic smile told me everything I needed to know about how this would go. And when she led me to the conference room where 3 people sat around a table with my resume in front of them, I could see their expressions shift from neutral professionalism to polite disappointment. I apologized for my tardiness, started to explain about my car situation, and then stopped myself because it sounded exactly like what it was, which was an excuse, a story about personal drama that had no place in a professional setting. The interview limped forward for another 25 minutes, my answers coming out flat and unprepared, my usual confidence completely absent, and when the marketing director asked why I wanted to work for their company, I nearly said because I need to escape my family but caught myself and delivered some hollow statement about growth opportunities. They thanked me for my time with the particular kindness people use when they've already decided against you. And I walked back through that glass door, knowing I'd blown my chance. Knowing that job with its $20,000 salary increase had just evaporated because my parents valued Blake's convenience over my professional future. The rejection email arrived before I even made it home. A form letter thanking me for my interest and wishing me luck in my search. And I sat in the rideshare reading it 3 times before the driver asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I was the opposite of okay. I was a person whose family had just sabotaged her career advancement without a second thought, but I smiled and said I was fine, because that's what capable people do. They pretend everything's manageable even when their world is actively falling apart. I couldn't afford another rideshare back to my apartment, so I called my coworker Jenna from the grocery store and asked if she could pick me up, promising to explain everything later. She arrived 30 minutes later in her beat-up Honda Civic, took one look at my face, and didn't ask questions until we were on the highway heading back across town. When I finally told her the whole story, words tumbling out in an angry, hurt rush, she went silent for a full minute before saying the thing I needed to hear, which was that my family was messed up and I had every right to be furious. She offered to let me borrow her car to drive to my parents' house and get mine back. And I accepted because I was done being the accommodating daughter, done pretending this was normal family dysfunction that I should handle with grace and understanding. We stopped at my apartment so I could change out of my interview clothes, and then Jenna drove me to the house I'd grown up in, the modest ranch-style home in a middle-class neighborhood where I'd learned all the wrong lessons about love and loyalty. My Subaru sat in the driveway, already looking wrong there, already feeling like something that belonged to me being displayed as if it belonged to them. Blake was in the front yard washing it with the hose, his movements casual and relaxed, like he was cleaning his own vehicle, like he had every right to be touching something I'd worked 3 years to buy. When he saw me get out of Jenna's car, he had the audacity to smile and wave, to call out that he was just taking care of it for me, making sure it stayed clean while he used it. The confrontation that followed happened on that front lawn with neighbors watching from windows and porches, my voice rising despite my intention to stay calm, Blake's smirk growing wider as he realized how much power he had in this moment. I demanded my keys back, demanded he step away from my car, and he laughed like I'd told a hilarious joke, said Mom and Dad had given him permission, so what I wanted didn't really matter. My mother came out the front door then, her face arranged in an expression of wounded confusion, asking why I was making such a scene. reminding me that we were family and what was mine was theirs and theirs was mine, conveniently forgetting that nothing of theirs had ever been mine when I needed it. My father followed her out, his accountant's face set in stern disapproval, and he told me to stop being dramatic, that I was always so selfish, and this was exactly the kind of behavior that disappointed them most. I tried to explain about the missed interview, about the money I'd spent on rideshare, about the basic violation of taking something that belonged to me without asking, but they talked over me like my words were just noise, meaningless sounds that didn't deserve acknowledgement. Blake stood behind them grinning, the golden child protected by parents who would burn me at the stake before they'd let him face a single consequence. And I realized with absolute clarity that this would never change, that I could be 45 years old and they'd still be stealing from me to give to him. My mother's final argument was that Blake needed the car for job interviews, a claim so ridiculous I actually laughed out loud, because Blake hadn't had a job interview in 7 months, hadn't even pretended to look for work since his unemployment benefits had run out, and my parents had started giving him cash to cover his minimal expenses. When I pointed this out, my mother's face went hard, and she said I didn't know what Blake was going through, that he was dealing with depression and anxiety, and needed support, not judgment from a sister who'd always looked down on him. I asked for my keys one more time, my voice flat and exhausted, and my mother crossed her arms and said no. They were keeping the car until Blake got back on his feet, and I could either accept that with grace, or prove once and for all what kind of person I really was. A neighbor from across the street, an elderly woman named Doris Hode, lived there for probably 40 years, stood on her porch watching the entire exchange, and when my eyes met hers, I saw something that looked like sympathy and recognition, like she understood exactly what she was witnessing. That look gave me something to hold on to, some tiny validation that I wasn't crazy or selfish or wrong, that what was happening here was genuinely messed up. I got back in Jenna's car without another word to my parents, my hands shaking so hard I had to sit on them, and as we pulled away I saw Blake climb into my Subaru and back it into the garage like he was hiding evidence, like he knew this was wrong even if he'd never admit it. The next morning I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from hitting rock bottom, the understanding that I needed to approach this situation legally, rather than emotionally, because my parents had proven they operated without conscience or basic decency. I dug through my filing cabinet until I found my car registration, my insurance documents, my bill of sale, all of it in my name and only my name, all of it proving beyond any doubt that the vehicle they'd taken was legally mine. I called the police non-emergency line and explained the situation to a bored-sounding officer who listened to my story and then told me I had every legal right to retrieve my property, that he could send someone to accompany me if I thought there might be trouble, that this was a straightforward case of unauthorized use of a vehicle. Armed with that information and a police officer named Garcia who agreed to follow me to my parents' house, I felt something like hope for the first time since discovering my car missing. Officer Garcia was maybe 30, professional and calm, and had assured me that cases like this were more common than I'd think, that family members stealing from each other happened all the time. We arrived at my parents' house at 9 in the morning, early enough that Blake would still be asleep, and my parents would be having their coffee, and I knocked on the door with my paperwork in hand, and a uniformed officer standing beside me, thinking this would finally force accountability, finally make them understand they couldn't just take what wasn't theirs. My father answered the door in his bathrobe, his expression shifting from confusion to anger when he saw the officer, and before I could even speak, he disappeared back into the house and returned with a document I'd never seen before. It was labeled Temporary Transfer of Ownership, filled out with official-looking language about me voluntarily allowing Blake to use the vehicle for an indefinite period, and at the bottom was a signature that looked enough like mine to be convincing if you didn't look closely. My stomach dropped through the floor as I stared at that forged signature, at the date listed as 4 weeks prior, at the calculated premeditation this represented. My father handed it to Officer Garcia with the confident air of someone who believed he'd outmaneuvered me, explained that Eid signed this document last month and was now having regrets, trying to back out of an agreement ID made voluntarily. Officer Garcia examined the paper, looked at me with new skepticism in his eyes, and I stammered out that Eid never signed anything, that the signature was forged, that this entire document was fabricated, but the damage was done. The situation was now murky enough that the officer said this looked like a civil matter rather than criminal theft, that I'd need to resolve it through family court or small claims rather than through police intervention. My mother appeared in the doorway then, her face arranged in an expression of hurt confusion, and she said she was shocked. I was trying to claim the signature was fake, that we'd all sat at the kitchen table and worked this out together, that she couldn't believe I'd stooped to involving police in a family disagreement. The lies rolled off her tongue so smoothly, so confidently, that for a moment I doubted my own memory, wondered if maybe I was the crazy one, if maybe this had happened and I'd somehow blocked it out. But then I looked at Blake's smirking face appearing behind my parents, and the clarity returned, the absolute certainty that they were lying, that they'd forged my signature and created a fake paper trail, because they'd known all along this day would come. Officer Garcia suggested I consult with a lawyer, handed me a card for legal aid services, and left me standing on my parents' porch feeling more violated than I had when the car first disappeared. My father's parting words before he shut the door were that if I continued making trouble, they'd tell everyone I was mentally unstable, that I'd been struggling with reality for months, that they were worried about me, and might need to seek psychiatric help on my behalf. The threat was clear, the message unmistakable, which was that they would destroy my reputation and credibility before they'd admit wrongdoing or return my property. 3 days passed in a blur of rage and helplessness. 3 days of borrowing Jenna's car to get to work and searching for lawyers I couldn't afford, and trying to understand how parents could hate their child enough to commit fraud against her. Then my phone rang at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, and it was my mother's number, and stupidly, desperately, I answered, hoping she was calling to apologize, to say they'd gone too far, to make this right. Instead, she told me that Blake had gotten into a small accident with my Subaru, nothing major, just backed into a mailbox while texting, but the front bumper was damaged, and I needed to file an insurance claim. The words didn't compute at first, my brain refusing to process what she was actually saying, which was that they expected me to commit insurance fraud to cover damage Blake had caused to my stolen vehicle. I asked how much the damage was, and she said probably $1,200 to repair properly, but it would be fine. I just needed to say, I was driving when it happened, file a claim with my insurance company, and everything would be sorted out. When I said absolutely not, when I explained that was insurance fraud and I wasn't risking my coverage or my legal standing to fix Blake's mistake, my mother's voice turned vicious in a way I'd rarely heard. She said I was being cruel, that I was punishing Blake for one small error, that a real sister would help her brother instead of throwing him under the bus over something so minor. My father got on the line and informed me they were filing the claim under my policy, with or without my cooperation, that as far as the insurance company would know, I'd been driving, and if I contradicted their story, I'd be the one committing fraud by lying to investigators. The audacity was breathtaking, the complete lack of moral compass stunning even for parents who'd already proven themselves capable of theft and forgery. I hung up on them and immediately called my insurance company, my voice shaking as I reported that my vehicle had been taken without permission and was being used by someone not on my policy, that any accidents or claims filed should be investigated as potentially fraudulent. The insurance representative I spoke with was sympathetic but firm, explained that they'd open an investigation, that I'd need to file a police report about the unauthorized use, that this could take weeks to resolve, and in the meantime my coverage might be in limbo. I did exactly what she advised, filed another police report specifically about the insurance fraud attempt, and felt the situation spiral further out of my control, with every official document I signed. My parents called 17 times that afternoon, left voicemails that escalated from angry to threatening, messages saying I was destroying the family, that I was a traitor, that they'd never forgive this betrayal. The irony of them calling me a traitor while actively defrauding me was apparently lost on them, but then again, people who steal from their children rarely possess the self-awareness for irony. Blake sent me a text that night saying I was ruining his life, that Mom and Dad were furious with him because of what I'd done, that I'd always been jealous of him, and this proved it. I blocked all 3 of their numbers before I went to bed, exhausted and heartsick, wondering how family could feel more dangerous than strangers, how the people who were supposed to protect me had become the people I most needed protection from. Within 48 hours of me filing the insurance fraud report, my phone started ringing with numbers I recognized from childhood, voices I hadn't heard from in months or years, all of them calling to tell me what a terrible person I was. My parents had launched a full-scale campaign to paint me as the villain, calling every aunt, uncle, cousin, and family friend they could think of, spinning a story where I was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned Blake in his time of need, who'd refused to help family out of pure selfishness, who was now trying to get her own brother arrested over a simple misunderstanding. The lies were so elaborate, so detailed, that some part of me had to admire the effort, even while I reeled from the betrayal of watching my entire extended family turn against me based on fiction. My grandmother Judith called first, her 81-year-old voice wavering with disappointment as she asked how I could do this to my parents, to my brother, to the family name. Shed, always been Patricia's biggest supporter, had always made excuses for my mother's favoritism by saying that boys needed more attention, that girls were naturally more self-sufficient, and now she deployed the full force of her age and moral authority to shame me into submission. She said Shed never thought she'd see the day when her own granddaughter would choose money over family, would involve police in private matters, would be so cold and calculating. I tried to explain what had actually happened, tried to tell her about the theft and the forgery and the fraud. But she talked over me just like my parents did, said Shed heard my side from Patricia, and it was clear I was twisting things to make myself look better. My Aunt Lorraine, my mother's younger sister, sent a text message so long it came through in 4 parts, a manifesto about family loyalty and sacrifice, and how our grandmother had raised them to always put family first no matter what. She wrote that my mother had sacrificed everything to raise me, had given up her career and her dreams to be home with her children, and I was repaying that sacrifice by dragging her through legal hell over a car. The fact that my mother had never had a career to sacrifice, that Shed married my father right out of high school, and had never worked outside the home by choice, apparently didn't matter in this revised history where she was a martyred saint and I was the ungrateful villain. Lorraine's final text said she was ashamed to call me family, that Shed be telling her children to learn from my example of what not to be, and I should think long and hard about the legacy I was creating. The family group chat, which I'd muted months ago because it was mostly my mother sharing prayer requests and Blake sharing memes, suddenly exploded with activity. Dozens of messages coming in over the course of an afternoon. All of them about me. My uncle Raymond, my father's older brother, wrote that I'd always been the difficult one, the child who questioned everything, and made family gatherings uncomfortable with my attitude. My cousin Marcus, who I'd barely spoken to since we were teenagers, chimed in saying he'd heard from his mom that I was having some kind of breakdown, and maybe I needed professional help before I hurt someone. Aunt Bethany, who I'd actually liked growing up, sent a sad face emoji, and wrote that she was praying for me, that the devil was clearly working through me, that I needed to repent and ask forgiveness before it was too late. Only one person in that entire group chat broke ranks, my cousin Sienna, who was 31 and had always been the family's other black sheep for leaving her husband and refusing to go back to him despite everyone's pressure. She sent me a private message saying she couldn't publicly defend me, because Shed get the same treatment, but she believed me. Shed's seen how our family operated, and I should stand my ground no matter what they said. Her message was the only thing that kept me from completely falling apart that night, the only evidence that someone in my blood family could see through the manipulation and recognize abuse when it was happening right in front of them. But she was too scared of being targeted herself to speak up publicly, and I understood that fear even as I wished desperately for just one person to call out the lies in that group chat, to say that maybe they should hear my side before condemning me. The smear campaign didn't stop with family, because my parents were nothing if not thorough in their destruction. My mother called my workplace 3 times in 2 days, asking to speak with my manager Steve, and on the 3rd call, he finally came to find me on the floor and asked if we could talk in his office. My stomach twisted as I followed him back through the stockroom, certain I was about to be fired, certain my parents had found a way to destroy my employment along with everything else. Steve closed the door and looked at me with a combination of concern and confusion, said my mother had called saying I was having a mental breakdown, that I might be dangerous to myself or others, that she was worried about me being around customers and handling money while in an unstable state. I broke down completely then, tears streaming down my face as I told Steve everything, the whole ugly story from beginning to present, and I waited for him to side with my parents because why wouldn't he? They were older and more credible, and I was just the assistant manager having an emotional meltdown in his office. But Steve surprised me by believing every word, by saying he'd seen my work ethic for years and knew I was solid, by admitting his own mother had been manipulative, and he recognized the patterns I was describing. He promised my job was safe, that he'd stopped taking calls from my family, but he warned me that they were persistent, that they'd already called 3 times and would probably keep trying. The relief of being believed mixed with the horror of realizing my parents were actively trying to get me fired, trying to destroy my financial stability so I'd have no choice but to crawl back and submit to their control. That night, alone in my apartment, with my phone exploding with hateful messages from people who claimed to love me, I understood for the first time what complete isolation felt like. My parents had turned my entire family against me, had poisoned every relationship, had made sure that when I thought about reaching out for support, all I'd find was more judgment and hostility. They'd painted me so thoroughly as the villain that no one even thought to question their story. No one wondered why parents would need to launch such an aggressive campaign if they were really in the right. The loneliness was crushing, suffocating, and I sat on my bathroom floor at 2 in the morning wondering if they'd win simply because I couldn't withstand being hated by everyone I'd ever known. 4 days into my isolation, my doorbell rang at 7 in the evening, and I almost didn't answer it because I assumed it was another family member coming to yell at me in person. But when I checked the peephole, I saw Doris from across the street from my parents' house, the elderly woman who'd witnessed the lawn confrontation, and curiosity overrode caution. I opened the door to find her holding a casserole dish and wearing an expression of determined kindness, and she asked if she could come in and talk to me about something important. I let her in, confused but grateful for any human interaction that wasn't actively hostile, and we sat at my small kitchen table while she served us both the chicken casserole Shed brought. Doris was 72 years old, had lived in that neighborhood for 43 years, and Shed watched my family the entire time, with the particular attention of someone who understood dysfunction because Shed lived through her own. She told me Shed'd seen this exact pattern play out before, had watched my parents do to someone else exactly what they were doing to me, and she thought I deserved to know that I wasn't the first child they'd sacrifice for Blake's comfort. My confusion must have shown on my face because she reached across the table and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and said the words that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. "You have an older sister, sweetheart. Her name is Lauren, and they did this same thing to her 15 years ago." The shock was total and complete. My brain unable to process what Doris was telling me, because I had no older sister. I'd been raised as the eldest. That had been part of my role in the family. But Doris pulled out her phone and showed me pictures. Old photos from neighborhood gatherings where a girl, maybe 13 or 14, stood awkwardly at the edge of family groupings, dark hair and wary eyes, and I could see my father's jaw in her face, my mother's forehead. Doris explained that Lauren had been erased from family history, completely removed from the narrative, after Shed refused to give Blake money for his first car when he was 18, and she was 25 and working 2 jobs to support herself. Lauren had been the original capable daughter, the one who'd raised herself while our parents obsessed over baby Blake, the one who'd left home at 17 to escape the dysfunction, and built a life through pure determination. When Blake turned 18 and wanted a car he couldn't afford, our parents had pressured Lauren to co-sign a loan, to help her brother out, to prove she was a good family member. Lauren had refused because Shed already seen how Blake treated responsibility, how our parents enabled his worst behaviors, and Shed known co-signing would destroy her credit when he inevitably defaulted. Our parents had given him the ultimatum that family helps family or family becomes strangers, and when Lauren held firm, they'd disowned her completely, told everyone Shed abandoned them, rewritten history to erase her existence. Doris had kept in touch with Lauren over the years, had watched from across the street as my parents played out the same patterns with a new set of children, had seen me become the replacement-capable daughter now that Lauren was gone. She gave me Lauren's phone number, written on a piece of paper in shaky handwriting, and told me to call her, that Lauren would want to know she wasn't the only one, that the pattern had continued. I sat staring at that piece of paper for an hour after Doris left, my entire understanding of my family history rearranging itself, the realization settling in that I'd been living someone else's life, playing a role that had been vacated by a sister I'd never been allowed to know. I called Lauren at 9:30 that night, my hands shaking so hard I could barely dial, and when a woman's voice answered with a cautious hello, I blurted out who I was, and that Doris had given me her number. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought Shed hung up, but then I heard her breathing, shaky and uneven, and she said my name like a question, like she couldn't quite believe I was real. We talked for 3 hours that first night, Lauren's voice coming through the phone from Arizona, where Shed built a life as a real estate agent, where Shed created success and stability and peace, far away from the family that had discarded her like garbage. She told me her story, the pattern identical to mine, right down to the words our parents used, the way they'd weaponized her capability against her, the way Blake had been protected and coddled, while Shed been expected to parent herself. She described the co-signing incident, how our parents had called her selfish and ungrateful, how our father had said she was dead to him if she couldn't do this one thing for her brother, how our mother had cried and said Lauren was choosing money over love. Lauren had stood her ground because Shed already learned you can't reason with unreasonable people, and just like Shed predicted, Blake had defaulted on the car loan within 8 months, and if Shed co-signed, her credit would have been destroyed right as she was trying to buy her first home. Our parents had made good on their threat, had told the entire family that Lauren had abandoned them, had cut off all contact, and forbidden anyone from speaking to her on pain of the same treatment. They'd literally pretended she didn't exist, had removed her from photo albums, had never mentioned her name in my presence growing up, had rewritten family history so completely that I'd grown up thinking I was the oldest when I was actually the middle child. Lauren said Shed grieved for years, had gone to therapy, had worked through the pain of being erased by the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally, and Shed eventually built a chosen family that treated her with the respect our parents never had. Her advice to me was clear and uncompromising, which was to protect myself legally, to expect the attacks to get worse before they got better, to understand that our parents would never stop, never change, never admit wrongdoing. She said they operated from a playbook of narcissistic abuse, that Blake was the golden child who could do no wrong and we were the scapegoats who existed to serve his needs, that this dynamic was so entrenched it would take our parents' deaths to end it. The validation of hearing someone else name what I'd experienced, someone who'd lived it herself, someone who understood without me having to explain or justify, was worth more than any therapy session could have provided. Lauren offered to help pay for a lawyer, said Shed been waiting for years for this moment, for proof that she wasn't crazy, that the pattern had continued, that she hadn't been the problem. She wired me $1,500 the next morning, told me to find the best family lawyer I could afford, to fight this properly, to not let them steamroll me the way they'd steamrolled her before she knew she had options. For the first time since my car disappeared, I felt something other than despair. Felt the stirring of actual hope that maybe I could win this, maybe I wasn't alone, maybe there was a path forward that didn't involve submission or destruction. Finding Margaret Chen was like finding water in a desert, like stumbling across exactly the right weapon when you're surrounded by enemies. She was 52 years old, a family law attorney with steel gray hair, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every manipulation tactic humans could devise, and remained unimpressed by all of them. Her office was in a modest building downtown, and when I sat across from her desk laying out my entire story, she took notes in precise handwriting and didn't interrupt once until I'd finished. Then she looked at me with eyes that had probably witnessed 1,000 family destructions, and said the most beautiful words I'd ever heard, which were that I had an airtight case, and she was going to destroy my parents in court. Margaret reviewed the forged transfer document and confirmed it was textbook fraud, explained that vehicle theft, combined with identity fraud, made this a criminal matter, not just civil, and that my parents had made several critical mistakes in their scheming. She filed a comprehensive police report detailing every element of their crimes, from the initial theft to the forged signature to the attempted insurance fraud, and she sent my parents a cease and desist letter that laid out exactly how much legal trouble they were facing if they didn't return my vehicle immediately and cease all contact with my employer. The letter was 3 pages of legal language that basically said, sit down, shut up, and prepare to face consequences for the first time in your entitled lives, and Margaret delivered it via certified mail so we'd have proof they'd received and read it. Margaret warned me that my parents would escalate before they'd retreat, that narcissistic people don't respond to boundaries with compliance but with rage, and I should prepare for them to retaliate in whatever ways they could access. She advised me to document everything, to save every text and voicemail and email, to keep a detailed journal of every interaction and incident, because we were building a case that would protect me, not just now, but potentially for years to come. She helped me file for a restraining order preventing my parents from contacting my workplace, got it granted on the basis of harassment and attempted interference with employment, and suddenly I had legal protection that felt like armor against their attacks. The court date was set for 3 weeks out, which felt like both too long and too soon. 3 weeks to prepare, and 3 weeks to endure their escalating fury. Margaret advised me to move any important documents or valuables to a bank safety deposit box, to change my locks, even though they didn't have keys to my apartment, to basically treat them like the criminals they'd proven themselves to be. I followed every piece of advice, spent an entire Saturday moving birth certificates and social security cards and photo albums to a safety deposit box at my bank, installed a Ring doorbell camera, so I'd have video evidence if they showed up at my apartment, and felt simultaneously paranoid and vindicated in my precautions. Blake showed up at my apartment 10 days before the court date, at midnight on a Tuesday, when I was already asleep, and started pounding on my door hard enough to shake the frame. The Ring camera captured everything: his drunk stumbling, his slurred screaming about how I was ruining his life, his threats that he'd make me pay for getting him in trouble with mom and dad. My neighbor Felix, a 29-year-old firefighter who lived 2 doors down, came out in his pajamas to see what the commotion was, and Blake turned his aggression on Felix immediately, getting in his face and trying to start a physical fight. Felix stayed calm and called the police while I stayed inside with my door locked, watching through the Ring app as Blake deteriorated from angry drunk to sobbing mess, crying about how nothing was ever his fault, and everyone always blamed him for everything. The police arrived within 8 minutes, and Blake was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, harassment, and violating the restraining order I'd just gotten against my parents that technically extended to Blake as a member of their household. Felix gave a statement as a witness, clearly describing Blake's threats and aggressive behavior, and I provided the Ring footage that captured every ugly moment. Blake spent the night in jail, and my parents bailed him out within 2 hours of the jail opening in the morning, and Margaret filed for an emergency restraining order against Blake specifically, which was granted that same afternoon. My parents' response was to send flying monkeys, people from church and their social circle who called me with concern trolling questions, asking if I'd considered how this was affecting my mother's health, suggesting that maybe I should be the bigger person and drop the charges for the sake of family peace. One woman named Cheryl, who'd been in my mother's prayer group for 20 years, called and said she was shocked that a daughter could treat her parents this way, that the Bible said to honor your father and mother, that I was bringing shame on myself and dishonor on God. I listened to her entire speech and then asked if the Bible also said it was okay to steal from your children and commit fraud, and she hung up on me without answering. The isolation that had felt crushing a week earlier now felt like protection, like I was cutting out a cancer that had been slowly killing me for 28 years. Every person who revealed themselves as my parents' ally was actually doing me a favor by showing me who they really were, who I didn't need to waste any more energy on. Felix checked on me regularly after the Blake incident, brought me coffee and made sure I was eating, and his quiet kindness reminded me that there were good people in the world, that not everyone operated from a place of manipulation and self-interest. He told me about his own family cutting him off when he'd chosen firefighting over taking over his father's business, about learning that sometimes the family you choose is more real than the family you're born into, and his understanding made me feel less alone than I'd felt in years. 2 weeks before court, I followed Margaret's advice and checked my credit report, something I should have been doing regularly but had never thought was necessary, because who steals from their own children, right? The answer appeared on my screen in stark black numbers that made my vision tunnel and my hands go numb. A credit card I'd never opened with a balance of $7,300, opened 4 months earlier in my name, with an address listed as my parents' house. The fraudulent charges dated back to before they'd even asked to borrow my car, which meant this hadn't been an impulsive decision or a desperate reaction, but a calculated, premeditated financial crime they'd been committing for months, while smiling to my face at family dinners. I clicked through the statement details with growing horror, seeing charges at stores near my parents' house, purchases that lined up perfectly with things Blake had mentioned in passing, a new gaming computer he was excited about, designer clothes he'd been wearing, furniture for his basement bedroom. My parents had been funding Blake's lifestyle on my credit, racking up thousands of dollars in debt that would have destroyed my credit score if I hadn't discovered it, that would have followed me for years, that would have prevented me from buying a house, or getting better insurance rates, or maybe even keeping my job if an employer ran a background check. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. The level of planning and deception it required, the complete disregard for my financial future or well-being. I called Margaret immediately, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form words, and she talked me through filing an identity theft report with the police and disputing the charges with the credit card company. The credit card company's fraud department was efficient and sympathetic, explaining that this happened more often than people realized, that family members stealing identities was actually the most common form of identity theft. They closed the account, removed it from my credit report, and flagged my credit for additional security monitoring. But the damage to my trust, to my sense of safety, to any remaining hope that my parents might have a conscience was irreparable and absolute. Margaret scheduled an emergency meeting with my parents' lawyer, a man named Robert Finch, who clearly knew his clients were guilty, but was paid to defend them anyway. We met in a conference room at his office. Me and Margaret on one side of the table, Robert and my parents on the other, and the contrast was stark between Margaret's calm professionalism and my parents' barely contained fury. My mother looked like she'd been crying, her makeup smudged and her eyes red, playing the victim so convincingly that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have felt sorry for her. My father sat rigid and silent, his accountant's face arranged in an expression of wounded dignity, like he was the one being persecuted instead of the one who'd committed multiple felonies against his own daughter. Robert opened with an attempt at negotiation, suggesting that perhaps we could all agree this had been a misunderstanding that got out of hand, that families sometimes had communication problems, and maybe we could resolve this without involving the courts. Margaret shut that down immediately, laying out the evidence of vehicle theft, document forgery, insurance fraud, identity theft, and credit card fraud, explaining that we weren't here to negotiate but to inform them of the additional criminal charges being filed. My mother gasped like Margaret had slapped her, and my father's face went red with rage that he barely controlled, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. My parents' defense, when Robert finally allowed them to speak, was the most delusional thing I'd ever heard, which was that they'd raised me for 18 years and spent probably $200,000 on my food, clothes, housing, and education, and therefore I owed them repayment for services rendered. My father actually said those words, services rendered, like parenting was a business transaction rather than a basic human obligation, like children were supposed to spend their adult lives repaying their parents for the crime of being born. My mother chimed in with tears streaming down her face, saying she'd sacrificed her whole life for me, had given up her dreams and her youth, and I was repaying that sacrifice by destroying the family over money that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Margaret's response was cold and factual, which was that parents have legal obligations to minor children, that providing basic necessities isn't optional or deserving of repayment, and that if they genuinely believed their adult daughter owed them reimbursement for her childhood, they should have established that agreement in writing before committing fraud. She laid out our terms, which were non-negotiable. Return the vehicle immediately. Pay for all damages, including the bumper repair. Pay my legal fees in full. Publicly retract the lies they'd told about me to family and friends, and stay away from me permanently. My parents rejected every term, said they'd rather go to trial and let a judge decide, confident that no judge would side with an ungrateful daughter over loving parents, who'd only been trying to help their son. Robert tried to negotiate down, suggesting they return the car and pay damages, but skip the public retraction and the restraining order. And Margaret said no deal, we wanted full accountability, or we'd pursue maximum criminal penalties. The meeting ended with my mother standing up and pointing at me across the table, her voice shaking with rage as she said, I was destroying the family, that I'd always been a selfish, difficult child, that she cursed the day Shed had me, and hoped I'd live with this guilt for the rest of my life. My father pulled her out of the room before she could say more, but the damage was done. The truth of what they really thought of me spoken out loud where no one could pretend it hadn't been said. In the hallway outside Robert's office, I collapsed against the wall and cried harder than I'd cried since this whole nightmare started. Not because I was hurt by my mother's words, but because I finally, completely, totally accepted that they would never love me the way I'd spent 28 years hoping they might. Margaret stood guard, making sure my parents couldn't come back, and when I'd pulled myself together enough to walk, she took me to a coffee shop across the street and bought me the most expensive latte on the menu. She told me what I needed to hear, which was that their behavior in that meeting had strengthened our case immeasurably, that judges hated financial elder abuse, but they hated parents abusing children just as much, and their complete lack of remorse or accountability would play very poorly in court. The identity theft charges were filed that afternoon, with Blake named as the primary suspect since his signature appeared on the credit card application, though my parents were listed as accessories since the card had been delivered to their address, and they'd clearly known about and facilitated the fraud. The criminal court moved faster than family court, and Blake was arrested 2 days later, charged with identity theft and credit card fraud, both felonies that could carry prison time if convicted. My parents immediately hired him an expensive criminal defense attorney, dipping into their retirement savings to protect their golden child one more time, and the irony that they'd spend their own money freely to defend him, while stealing mine to support him, was apparently lost on everyone but me. The morning of the court date arrived cold and clear, one of those early winter days where the sky is blue and merciless and everything feels exposed. I dressed in my most professional outfit, the same one I'd worn to that disastrous interview, and Margaret met me in the courthouse parking lot to review our strategy one final time. She reminded me to stay calm no matter what my parents said, to let the evidence speak for itself, to trust that the judge would see through their manipulation because judges saw this kind of family dysfunction every single day. Felix had asked for the day off to come support me, sitting in the gallery behind me. And Doris had driven 40 minutes from the old neighborhood to be there as well, her presence a reminder that not everyone in my life had chosen my parents' version of reality. My parents arrived with Robert and Blake, who'd been released on bail and apparently decided to show up despite not being a party to this case, probably because he couldn't stand missing the drama. My mother wore a navy dress that made her look small and fragile, her favorite costume for playing victim. And my father wore a suit that reminded everyone he was a professional, a taxpayer, a respectable member of society who couldn't possibly be guilty of the crimes we were accusing him of. Blake wore jeans and a polo shirt, his golden child privilege extending to not even trying to look courtroom appropriate, his smirk back in place now that the initial shock of arrest had worn off. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named Judge Patricia Morrison, and she called the case to order with an efficiency that suggested she'd already read the briefs and wasn't interested in theatrics. Margaret presented our evidence methodically, starting with the vehicle registration, proving ownership, the police reports documenting the theft, the forged transfer document with handwriting analysis, showing it wasn't my signature, the insurance fraud attempt documented in recorded phone calls I'd made to my insurance company, and finally, the identity theft report and credit card statements, showing the months-long fraud scheme. Each piece of evidence was entered into the record. Each document passed to the judge for her review, and I watched my parents' faces grow tighter and more desperate as the weight of their crimes became undeniable. Doris was called as our first witness, and she testified about what she'd seen the day I'd confronted my parents on their lawn, about my father presenting the forged document, about Blake washing my car like it belonged to him, about the neighborhood knowing something wrong was happening but no one wanting to get involved. Her testimony was simple and credible. An elderly woman with no stake in the outcome, just telling the truth about what she'd witnessed. And I could see the judge taking notes, her expression giving nothing away but her attention absolute. Lauren appeared next via video testimony from Arizona, her face appearing on a screen set up in the courtroom, and the shock on my parents' faces when they saw her was almost worth everything I'd been through. My mother actually gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, and my father went completely white, like he'd seen a ghost, which in a way he had since they'd spent 15 years pretending she didn't exist. Lauren testified about the pattern of abuse, about how they'd erased her for refusing to enable Blake, about how she'd watched from a distance as they'd repeated the exact same behaviors with me, and her testimony established that this wasn't a one-time mistake or misunderstanding, but a deliberate pattern of exploitation that spanned decades. My manager Steve testified via video call about the harassment calls from my mother, about her attempts to get me fired by claiming I was mentally unstable, and the judge's expression shifted from neutral to distinctly unimpressed when she heard that my parents had tried to destroy my employment. The Ring doorbell footage of Blake's midnight harassment played on the courtroom screen, his drunk threats and aggression clear and undeniable, and I watched the judge's face harden as she saw him trying to intimidate me at my own home. Margaret had built a case so comprehensive, so documented, so impossible to deny that I could feel the momentum shifting, could sense that we were winning in a way that went beyond just getting my car back. Robert tried to mount a defense, calling my father to testify about how difficult I'd always been, how I'd never appreciated their sacrifices, how they'd only been trying to help Blake get back on his feet after a rough patch. My father's testimony was smooth and practiced, hitting all the emotional notes about family and loyalty, and helping each other through hard times. But Margaret's cross-examination was surgical and devastating. She walked him through the timeline of the credit card fraud, getting him to admit he'd seen statements coming to his house in my name, getting him to admit he'd known Blake was using the card, getting him to admit he'd never once contacted me to ask if I knew about it. Margaret asked him directly if he'd forged my signature on the transfer document, and he insisted I'd signed it willingly, and then Margaret pulled out the handwriting analysis report and asked if he was calling the forensic expert a liar. My father stumbled, contradicted himself, finally fell back on saying he couldn't remember exactly how it happened, and the judge cut in to say that convenient memory loss wasn't a defense to forgery. My mother wasn't called to testify, probably because Robert knew she'd fall apart under cross-examination, but her outburst in the gallery came anyway, unable to control herself, as Margaret systematically destroyed their credibility. My mother stood up and shouted that this wasn't fair, that the car should have been Blake's anyway, that she'd given birth to me, and that gave her rights over anything I owned, and the judge banged her gavel and warned my mother to sit down and be quiet or be removed from the courtroom. My father tried to calm her, but my mother was beyond reason, years of entitlement and delusion finally breaking through her victim costume, and she screamed that I'd always been ungrateful, had always made their lives harder, had always been jealous of Blake, who was sensitive and needed protection. The judge had the bailiff escort my mother out, and the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of her revealed toxicity, the mask finally off where everyone could see what I'd been dealing with my entire life. Judge Morrison delivered her ruling, without retiring to chambers, looking directly at my parents as she spoke and saying she'd seen a lot of family dysfunction in her years on the bench, but rarely such a clear case of parental exploitation and financial abuse. She ordered the vehicle returned to me immediately, ordered my parents to pay $1,200 in repair costs, ordered them to pay my legal fees in full, and issued permanent restraining orders preventing all contact with me for a minimum of 5 years. She said the criminal charges for identity theft and fraud would proceed separately, but based on what she'd seen in this courtroom, she'd be recommending the district attorney pursue maximum penalties. My parents sat in stunned silence, Robert trying to argue for lesser penalties, but the judge cut him off and said her ruling was final, that they had 48 hours to comply or face contempt of court charges and possible jail time. Blake, who'd been sitting in the gallery, stormed out before the judge dismissed us, and my mother followed him out, still crying, still playing victim, still unable to comprehend that their actions had consequences. My father signed the papers Robert put in front of him, his hands shaking, his face gray, and for just a moment I felt something that might have been pity, if Id had any emotional energy left for people who'd tried so hard to destroy me. Outside the courthouse, Lauren called me immediately, having watched the whole proceeding via video, and we cried together for 20 minutes, healing tears this time instead of grief tears, relief that we'd been believed, that we'd been vindicated, that maybe we could both finally close this chapter. Felix and Doris took me to lunch at a diner near the courthouse, and Margaret joined us after filing the final paperwork, and we celebrated a victory that had cost me everything and still felt worth it. Margaret told me to expect my parents to try one final hoovering attempt, a last manipulation to try to get me back under their control, but to stay strong, to maintain the boundaries, to remember that the guilt I felt was programmed into me and not based in reality. 6 months later, my Subaru sits in my new apartment's covered parking space, detailed and maintained and completely mine in a way it hadn't been even before my parents stole it. I got it back 2 days after the court ruling, drove it straight to the best detailer in town, and paid extra to have every trace of Blake removed, every fingerprint wiped away, and when I picked it up that evening, I sat in the parking lot crying again. Happy tears this time. Freedom tears. The bumper had been repaired on my parents' dime, and Id had the locks rekeyed even though I'd never given them a spare, because paranoia was just good sense when you'd been raised by people who thought your belongings were community property. The marketing job I'd missed because of that disastrous interview had reopened 3 months later, and the hiring manager remembered me, called to ask if I was still interested, and I interviewed again, this time with no family drama to derail me, no stolen car to explain away. I got the offer the same day, a $23,000 raise and a title bump to senior marketing coordinator, and I signed the acceptance letter in my therapist's office, during a session where we both celebrated how far I'd come from that devastated woman standing in an empty parking space at dawn. The new job came with better benefits, actual vacation time, and coworkers who treated me like a professional instead of an assistant manager, who'd never amount to anything more. I moved to a nicer apartment, in a building with actual security, a doorman who screens visitors, cameras in all the common areas, the kind of place where my parents couldn't just show up and start pounding on my door. The rent was higher, but I could afford it now, and the peace of mind was worth every extra dollar. Felix lives 3 blocks away in his own place, and we've been dating for 2 months, taking it slow, building something based on respect and reciprocity instead of obligation and guilt. He understands when I have bad days, when family holidays trigger me, when I need to talk through the programming I'm still unpacking in therapy, and he's shown me what healthy love looks like, what it means when someone chooses to be in your life instead of demanding you earn your place in theirs. Therapy has been the hardest and most necessary part of healing. 2 sessions a week with Dr. Sarah Kim, who specializes in family trauma and narcissistic abuse recovery. She's helped me understand that being labeled capable was code for easy to exploit, that my parents never loved me as an individual but only valued my utility, that the role I played in that family was never about who I actually was but about what they needed me to be. We've worked through my parentification, the way I was forced to be the adult in the relationship while they acted like children, the way they trained me to manage their emotions and take responsibility for their failures. Dr. Kim has helped me see that forgiveness isn't required for healing, that boundaries aren't cruelty, That sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who will never change. I've built a chosen family that feels more real than blood ever did. Sunday dinners with Felix and Doris, monthly video calls with Lauren, where we share our victories and our struggles, regular coffee dates with Jenna, who lent me her car and believed me when belief was scarce. My cousin Sienna finally broke from the family 6 weeks after the trial, called me crying to apologize for not defending me publicly, explained that watching what happened to me gave her the courage to set her own boundaries. We've gotten close in a way we never were as children, bonding over shared trauma and shared escape, and she tells me stories about family gatherings I'm no longer invited to, the tension and dysfunction that's gotten worse now that they don't have me to scapegoat. Blake was convicted of identity theft and credit card fraud, sentenced to 18 months in prison with eligibility for early release after 9 months, and my parents have taken out a second mortgage on their house to pay his legal fees and keep him commissary while he serves his time. The irony that they'll spend their retirement money on him, while refusing to pay what the court ordered me, has not escaped anyone's notice. But it's no longer my problem, no longer something I have to manage or fix or take responsibility for. My father sent one attempt at hoovering 2 months ago, an email saying they forgave me for tearing the family apart, that I could come home any time, and all would be forgotten, as if I was the one who needed forgiveness, as if home was a place he'd ever want to return to. My grandmother Judith passed away 4 months after the trial, and I didn't attend her funeral, chose to protect my peace, instead of subjecting myself to a room full of people who believed my parents' lies. I sent flowers anonymously, and wrote her a letter I never mailed, explaining why I couldn't be there, hoping she understood somewhere that I'd loved her even though she'd sided against me. Lauren told me the funeral was tense, that my absence was felt, that some family members had started questioning the official narrative once I wasn't there to contradict anymore, once they'd had time to think about how convenient my parents' version was, how it painted them as innocent victims, and me as ungrateful villain, with no nuance or complexity. I keep a journal now, pages and pages of processing and revelation, and sometimes I write letters to my parents that I burn in ceremonies with Lauren, releasing the pain and anger, reclaiming my narrative from the lies they told about me. I've come to understand that their conditional love was never love at all, that real love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm, that family is supposed to be a safe place, not a battlefield where you constantly defend your right to exist as a separate person. The Subaru has become a symbol bigger than just a car, a representation of my independence, my self-worth, my refusal to be exploited anymore, and every time I drive it, I remember that I was capable enough to save myself. I think about how my parents used that word, capable, how they meant it as a compliment while using it as a weapon, how they praised my strength while ensuring I'd need every ounce of it to survive their abuse. But they were right, in a way they never intended. I am capable. Capable of setting boundaries, capable of pursuing justice, capable of building a life that doesn't include people who only want me around when I'm useful. The Sunset Highway drives I take now, windows down and music playing, feel like victory laps, celebrating a freedom I fought for and earned, a peace that came at the cost of everything familiar, but gained me something infinitely more valuable, which is myself. The phone rings sometimes with unknown numbers, and I've learned not to answer, to let potential flying monkeys go to voicemail, to protect my peace aggressively and without apology. The healing isn't linear. Some days I wake up angry, some days I wake up sad, some days I wake up guilty for cutting them off. But those guilty days are getting fewer and farther between as I unprogram the conditioning they spent 28 years installing. Being strong doesn't mean accepting abuse. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away, and your peace matters more than other people's comfort. I've learned that found family can heal what blood family broke, that there are people in this world who will choose you every single day without requiring you to earn that choice, that unconditional love exists but not with people who attach conditions to everything they give. My life now looks nothing like I thought it would 6 months ago, but it's mine in a way it never was when I was still trying to win approval from people who decided long ago I wasn't worth approving. The story my parents tell about me is their business now, no longer something I have to manage or correct, or waste energy defending, because the people who matter know the truth, and the people who believed their lies without question were never really my people anyway. So here's what I want to ask all of you watching this. Have you ever had to cut off family to protect yourself? Have you ever been the scapegoat in a family where someone else was the golden child? Drop your stories in the comments, because I promise you're not alone in this. And sometimes just knowing other people survived similar situations is enough to help you survive yours. Hit that like button if you believe boundaries are healthy. Smash subscribe if you want to hear more stories about choosing yourself over toxic family, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away from people who hurt you, even if they're related by blood. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought back or tried to keep the peace? Let me know in the comments. To everyone who's dealing with family dysfunction, who's questioning whether you're the problem because everyone keeps telling you that you are, who's wondering if you'll ever be free from people who claim to love you while treating you like property, I see you, I believe you, and I promise you that life on the other side of those boundaries is worth every uncomfortable moment it takes to establish them. Thank you for watching my story. Thank you for witnessing my truth, and I hope you find your own version of freedom, whatever that looks like for you. May you find the courage to save yourself, the wisdom to recognize abuse in whatever form it takes, and the strength to build a life that honors who you actually are, instead of who others need you to be. Drive safe, set boundaries, and remember that you're capable of so much more than surviving. You're capable of thriving once you stop letting other people steal your light.